Naledi Okafor had tranquilized 11 tigers in her career, and she still checked the loaded dart twice before every single one, out of habit more than doubt, the way some people always double-check a locked door even when they know they locked it. She'd been the zoo's senior wildlife veterinarian for 7 years by then, long enough to have handled births, deaths, translocations, and enough routine dental work on big cats that most mornings like this one felt closer to administrative than dangerous, a schedule to move through, a set of vitals to watch, a molar to fix and forget. The tiger this time was Amara, 6 years old, 410 pounds, scheduled for a routine dental procedure that had turned less routine the moment the imaging showed a cracked molar sitting close enough to the jaw nerve to worry the whole surgical team. Naledi had known Amara longer than she'd known almost anyone at the zoo, had been on shift the night Amara arrived as a rescue transfer from a shuttered roadside attraction 6 years earlier, thin and wary and missing half her whiskers on one side, and had watched her fill out into the animal she was now, confident and healthy, a favorite with the keepers precisely because she'd never lost the wariness entirely. She still watched people the way an animal watches something it's learned not to fully trust. Sentry, the sedation monitoring system MedVitals had installed across the zoo's veterinary wing 18 months earlier, had already calculated the dosage before Naledi finished her own manual check, cross-referencing Amara's weight, age, and prior sedation history against a database of several thousand recorded big cat procedures, and it came back with a number close enough to what Naledi would have chosen by hand that she didn't argue with it. She rarely did anymore. Theo Bramwell, Naledi's fiancé of 14 months, had led the engineering team that built Sentry, and he'd spent most of the past 2 years traveling between accredited zoos and wildlife sanctuaries installing it, this particular zoo included, which was how the two of them had met in the first place, over a delayed dosage calculation during a routine gorilla checkup that Naledi had flagged as too conservative and Theo had, somewhat sheepishly, admitted she was right about. She thought about that first conversation sometimes, the two of them arguing calmly over a printed dosage curve in the break room while a gorilla named Kasai slept soundly a floor below, and how easy it had been to like someone who took being wrong that gracefully, how different that Theo had felt from the version of engineers she'd sparred with at other facilities over the years, the ones who treated every clinical pushback as an attack on the product instead of information worth having. They'd moved in together 8 months in, faster than either of them had planned, mostly because his work kept him traveling and her apartment happened to sit closer to 3 of the accredited facilities on his rotation than his own, and there had been a long stretch, most of that first year, where the overlap between his work and hers felt like one of the better parts of the relationship rather than a complication. She understood what he was building better than most partners could have, and he understood, better than most engineers she'd dated before him, why she cared as much as she did about the animals on her table. The procedure began at 9:15 on a Tuesday morning, 6 people in the operating theater, Naledi at the head of the table monitoring Amara's vitals, a surgical resident named Priya on and assisting with the dental work, 2 veterinary technicians managing equipment, a large animal specialist named Foster Klein observing from the corner in case of complications, and Sentry's monitor glowing steadily on the wall, tracking heart rate, respiration, oxygen saturation, and core temperature in real time. For the first 11 minutes, everything moved the way it was supposed to, Amara's breathing slow and even, heart rate holding at a comfortable 58 beats per minute, and Priya working carefully around the cracked molar with the kind of focus that made the room feel almost peaceful despite the size of the animal on the table. At 11 minutes and 40 seconds, Sentry's monitor flagged a change, a small amber banner reading, sedation deviation, moderate, and Naledi glanced at it without much alarm. Because moderate deviations weren't rare, they usually meant a slight dip in respiration rate that resolved on its own within a minute or two as the anesthesia settled. One of the technicians, a younger woman named Odalise who'd only been at the zoo 8 months, glanced over at Naledi as if to check whether the flag warranted concern, and Naledi shook her head slightly, a small, practiced gesture that had never once been wrong before that morning. She watched the number for 15 seconds, respiration dropping from 12 breaths per minute to 9, well within the range Sentry's own documentation described as self-correcting in most cases, and she made a note to keep an eye on it rather than intervene immediately, the same call she'd made a dozen times before under similar amber flags. What she didn't see, because Sentry's interface didn't show it as a separate line, was that Amara's heart rhythm had shifted at almost exactly the same moment, a short run of irregular beats that had nothing to do with respiration at all, a rare arrhythmia triggered by an interaction between the anesthesia dose and an old, mostly healed heart injury from a fight with another tiger years before Amara had come to the zoo, an injury that had never shown up as a concern in any prior sedation. Because it had never been stressed in quite this particular way before. Sentry's alert system had been built, deliberately, to consolidate related vital sign changes into single composite alerts rather than firing off a cascade of separate warnings for every small fluctuation, because the engineering team, Theo's team, had spent the better part of a year fighting complaints from veterinary staff at other facilities about alert fatigue, too many low-priority pings pulling attention away from the animal and toward the screen, and the fix they'd landed on grouped respiratory and cardiac deviations that frequently co-occurred under sedation into one unified category, on the theory that a vet reading, sedation deviation, would naturally check both anyway. Most of the time, that theory held, respiratory and cardiac changes under anesthesia usually did move together, and grouping them cut alert volume by nearly 60% across the pilot facilities, a number Theo had been genuinely proud of, a number he'd presented at 2 industry conferences that spring, standing in front of rooms full of facility directors who'd applauded the reduction like it was an unambiguous win, because on paper, for the several thousand procedures the model had been validated against, it was. Naledi had sat in the audience at one of those conferences herself, in San Diego the previous November, and had clapped along with everyone else, proud of him in a way that had nothing complicated in it yet, no idea that the same slide he presented that day, the 60% alert reduction chart, would be the exact thing she'd be citing back to him from her own kitchen table 5 months later, except by then it wouldn't feel like an achievement anymore, it would feel like the shape of what almost happened. But an isolated cardiac event, arrhythmia without meaningful respiratory involvement, didn't announce itself the way the model expected, and Sentry's composite score treated it exactly the same as the ordinary respiratory dip Naledi had seen a dozen times before, the amber banner staying amber, the underlying number nudging slightly worse without ever crossing whatever threshold would have escalated it to red. 90 seconds after the first flag, Foster Klein, watching from the corner with a specialist's practiced peripheral attention, said quietly, her colors off, and Naledi looked up from the monitor at Amara's exposed gum line, subtly duskier than it had been a minute earlier, a sign that had nothing to do with the respiration number Sentry was tracking and everything to do with circulation, with a heart not moving blood the way it should. Pull up full waveform, Naledi said, and one of the technicians switched the display from Sentry's summary view to the raw cardiac trace underneath it, the thing almost nobody looked at directly anymore because the composite score was supposed to make that unnecessary, and there it was, plain and obvious once she was looking at the right data, a ragged, irregular rhythm that had been running for close to 2 minutes under a banner that still said, calmly, moderate. That's not respiratory, Naledi said, already reaching for the emergency cardiac kit instead of the standard sedation response kit sitting closer to hand, the one that would have been the automatic reach if she'd trusted the amber banner's framing a few seconds longer. That's cardiac, get me lidocaine and the defibrillator paddles just in case, now. Priya's head snapped up from the dental site. How bad, she asked, already peeling off her gloves to help. Bad enough, Naledi said, keep her airway secure, I need everyone else clear of the chest. The technician on the phone with the on-call cardiologist relayed numbers back and forth in short bursts, oxygen saturation 81 and falling, heart rate erratic between 40 and 90 with no discernible rhythm, and Naledi could hear her own pulse in her ears louder than she could remember hearing it in years, a strange doubled awareness of her own heart racing while she worked to steady someone else's. The next 4 minutes moved the way emergencies move, compressed and enormous at the same time, Priya stepping back from the dental site without being asked, Foster moving to help position the paddles, one technician on the phone with the on-call cardiologist consulting from home, Naledi's hands steady even as her voice sharpened with each instruction, and Amara's rhythm stabilizing on the second dose of lidocaine, heart rate settling back toward a rough, ragged version of normal, oxygen saturation climbing back out of the low 80s where it had quietly drifted while the composite score sat unbothered in amber. Foster caught her eye once, midway through, a brief steadying look that said, without words, that she was doing this right, and she held on to that look afterward more than she expected to, because in the moment itself there hadn't been room to feel anything except the next necessary action. It took another 20 minutes to fully stabilize her, the dental procedure abandoned entirely, the molar left for another day, and by the time Amara was breathing evenly under a green banner again, Nality's scrub top was soaked through at the back, and her hands, when she finally let herself notice them, weren't quite steady anymore. She didn't call Theo that afternoon. She filed the incident report first, methodical about it in a way that felt like the only available outlet for how frightened she'd actually been, timestamps pulled from the raw monitor logs, respiration and cardiac traces printed side by side, the 11-minute gap between the first amber flag and the moment she'd pulled up the raw waveform herself circled in red pen. Theo came by her apartment that evening, unaware yet of what had happened, carrying takeout from the Ethiopian place they both liked, and she watched something in his face change the moment he saw the printed report on her kitchen table, the color leaving his expression the way it had left Amara's gums that morning. "Walk me through it," he said, setting the food down without opening it, and she did, plainly, the same way she'd write it up for the accreditation board, no softening, no framing it as anything other than what it was. The composite alert masked an isolated cardiac event because your consolidation model assumes respiratory and cardiac deviations track together, she said. They usually do. I understand why you built it that way, but Amara's heart injury made this one an exception, and Sentry had no way to tell the difference between an exception and an ordinary dip because it was never looking at the cardiac trace as its own signal once the composite score kicked in. "How close was it?" he asked, and his voice had a flatness to it she hadn't heard from him before, not defensive yet, just braced. "Close enough that I'm not going to pretend it wasn't," she said. "She's fine, she's stable, but there was a stretch of maybe 90 seconds where the system was telling me everything was moderate and unremarkable while her heart was doing something it has never done under sedation before." He read through the full report twice, sitting at her kitchen table with the food going cold between them, and when he finally looked up, he didn't try to explain the engineering rationale the way she'd half expected him to, half braced for. "I built the consolidation logic myself," he said. "I was the one who pushed hardest for it. I had 6 facilities telling us alert fatigue was making vets tune the system out entirely, and I thought grouping correlated signals was the responsible fix, and I never once modeled what happens when the correlation breaks." "I need you to actually hear what I'm telling you," Nality said, "not just agree with the report, because I've watched people nod along at incident reports before and then quietly protect the thing they built anyway." "I'm not protecting it," he said. "I'm sitting here trying to figure out how many other facilities are running the exact version of this that almost killed a tiger this morning. That's not a hypothetical question for me right now, Nality, that's every single site I installed this at." That answer, more than anything softer he could have said, was the one that told her he'd actually understood the size of it. The next several weeks were strange in a way neither of them fully talked about. MedVitals pulled the consolidation feature from every active installation within 4 days, reverting every facility to fully separated respiratory and cardiac alerts, which meant a sharp jump in alert volume everywhere, exactly the alert fatigue problem the consolidation had been built to solve in the first place, now unsolved overnight, and Theo spent most evenings on calls with anxious facility directors instead of at Nality's apartment. She understood why he had to be there, she did, and some part of her respected that he didn't try to delegate the hardest calls to someone else on his team, but there was also a particular loneliness to watching someone pour every ounce of urgency into fixing the thing that had nearly cost her a patient's life on her table, while the actual conversation about what almost happened kept getting pushed to, after this week. Her own zoo's accreditation board convened a review 2 weeks after the incident, a smaller, quieter affair than she'd expected, for board members and the zoo's director sitting around a conference table while she walked them through the timeline, the same one she'd handed Theo that first night, timestamps and traces laid out plainly, no editorializing. "Was this a failure of your judgment or the system's?" one board member asked, a retired surgeon named Dr. Halvard who'd sat on the board for longer than Nality had worked there, and she'd thought about how to answer that question for 2 weeks by the time he asked it. "Both, and neither, exactly," she said. "I read the Amber Banner the way I'd been trained to read Amber Banners for 18 months, because 18 months of Amber Banners resolving themselves teaches you something about what Amber means. That's not a failure of judgment, that's what a well-functioning system is supposed to teach you. The failure was upstream of me, in a design decision that assumed correlation where there wasn't always correlation." Another board member, a younger woman new to the position who worked in public health outside her board duties, asked whether Naledi thought the zoo should suspend use of any vendor monitoring system entirely until every facility using it had gone a full year without incident, and Naledi took her time answering that one too. "I understand the instinct," she said, "but I don't think the answer is throwing out monitoring technology altogether. The raw data Sentry captures is genuinely better than what any of us could track by hand in real time. The problem was never the sensors, it was one layer of interpretation sitting on top of good data, and that layer is fixable in a way that going back to pure manual monitoring wouldn't actually make anyone safer long term. And if it happens again next week, before the vendor's fix rolls out everywhere," Dr. Halvard pressed, "what changes on your end?" "I don't wait for the summary screen to tell me something's wrong anymore," she said. "I pull the raw traces at the first amber flag now, every time, which slows procedures down slightly, and I think that's an acceptable cost." The board accepted her account without much further debate, credited her response during the emergency itself, and recommended the zoo formally request the fully separated protocol as a standing requirement rather than a default setting that could theoretically be reconfigured later, a recommendation Naledi had drafted herself before the meeting even started. At home, the conversation was harder to resolve into anything as clean as a board recommendation, because there wasn't a policy fix available for the particular kind of tired she felt every evening. Theo came home late from another facility call, apologetic and distracted, already halfway back into his phone before he'd finished saying hello. They tried to talk about it properly one Sunday almost a month later, sitting on her balcony with coffee going cold the way the takeout had, and she told him, as evenly as she could manage, that she needed him to understand this wasn't only a professional near miss for her, it was 90 seconds standing over an animal she'd cared for 6 years while a system built by the man she was planning to marry told her everything was fine. "I know that," he said, "and I don't know what to do with it besides keep fixing what's actually broken." "I'm not asking you to stop fixing it," she said, "I'm asking whether you can actually sit in the same room with how close it was, instead of turning it into a problem to be engineered away as fast as possible, because that instinct, the one that wants to move past the fear part and straight into the fix, that instinct is exactly what built the consolidation feature in the first place, moving fast past a question that needed more sitting with." He didn't have an answer for that right away, and she didn't push him for one, and the silence between them that afternoon felt different from any silence they'd had before, not angry exactly, just honest about a gap that had opened up and hadn't closed. He tried, in the weeks after that conversation, she could see him trying, canceling one facility trip to stay for a weekend that had nothing scheduled on it, asking her more than once to walk him through exactly what those 90 seconds had felt like from where she was standing, and she appreciated the effort even as she noticed that the trying itself had a slightly effortful quality to it, like a habit being practiced rather than something that had simply changed underneath, and she wasn't sure, watching him ask careful, well-intentioned questions on a Saturday afternoon, whether that distinction mattered less than she thought it did or more. Amara made a full recovery, the cracked molar treated successfully 3 weeks later under a fully separated alert protocol, both respiratory and cardiac traces displayed independently on 2 monitors instead of merged into one, and Naledi stood watch through the entire second procedure with a kind of vigilance that had nothing to do with not trusting the technology and everything to do with never wanting to feel that specific 90 seconds again. She remembered, watching the second procedure unfold cleanly, both monitors calm and separate and legible, thinking that this was probably what the system should have looked like from the beginning, more screens, more numbers, slightly more for a tired vet's eyes to track, a small tax paid every single day in exchange for never again mistaking an exception for an ordinary case, and she thought Theo would probably agree with that framing if she said it to him, which she eventually did, and he did agree, immediately and without hesitation. Which she noticed and didn't quite know what to do with, because agreement had never really been the thing missing between them. MedVitals eventually rebuilt the consolidation logic properly, 6 months later, with a much narrower definition of which signals could actually be grouped safely, and a hard rule, one Theo insisted on personally, that any patient with a documented prior cardiac irregularity of any kind would automatically run in fully separated mode regardless of what the general model recommended, a rule that existed, everyone on his team understood without him needing to say it explicitly, because of a tiger named Amara. He asked Naledi to be part of the review board for the rebuilt version, and she agreed, though she noticed, and never quite mentioned out loud, that the version of herself who sat on that review board 6 months later trusted the system's summary screen a good deal less than the version of herself who'd walked into that operating theater back in the spring. She still glanced at the raw traces herself now, every time, composite score or not. The review sessions themselves were thorough in a way the original development process apparently hadn't been. 6 facilities worth of veterinary staff dialed in over video calls, each asked the same blunt question Theo now opened every session with: what's the rarest true exception you've personally seen in 20 years of practice, the one case that would have broken this logic? And Naledi watched him write down every answer by hand instead of delegating the notes to someone junior, which struck her as a small, real change even if it wasn't the change she'd actually asked for that Sunday on the balcony. One of the other vets on the call, a large animal specialist from a sanctuary in Alberta, described a case eerily similar to Amara's, an old injury interacting unpredictably with sedation in a way no dataset would have anticipated without someone having lived through it first, and Naledi watched Theo's face while he listened, saw him absorb it the way an engineer absorbs a genuinely useful data point rather than a criticism to be managed, and thought, not without some sadness, that this was probably the best version of him, the one who could actually hold complexity like that, and that she'd gotten to see it mostly in a professional setting now instead of a personal one. The engagement didn't end in a single dramatic conversation. There wasn't a ring returned across a table or a door slammed shut. It wore down slower than that, over months of him traveling to fix what the incident had exposed and her needing something from those evenings that kept not quite arriving, until one night in early winter they both admitted, without much drama left in either of their voices, that the wedding they'd been loosely planning for the following summer wasn't going to happen. Not because either of them had stopped caring, but because something in how each of them had responded to those 90 seconds had shown them a difference neither wanted to pretend away. The conversation happened in the same kitchen where she'd first shown him the incident report, which she hadn't planned and only noticed afterward, sitting at the same table with 2 mugs of tea neither of them finished, and he said, at one point, "I keep thinking if I'd just handled that first week differently, been home more, none of this," and she'd shaken her head, because that wasn't quite it, not really. "It's not really about that week," she told him, "it's that the week showed me something that was probably always going to be there. You reach for the fix, I reach for sitting inside the fear until I understand it fully, and most of the time that difference is fine, it's even useful. But I don't think I want to build a life with someone whose first instinct in the worst moments is to solve past the feeling instead of staying in the room with me while I have it." He didn't argue with that, which she took, afterward, as its own kind of confirmation, not bitter, just quiet and mutual and a little sad in the ordinary way endings are sad even when they're also clearly right. Her mother, when Naledi finally told her over the phone a week later, asked only one question, not about Theo specifically, but about the tiger: is she really all right now? And Naledi had found herself more grateful for that question than for any of the sympathetic things people said about the relationship afterward, because it was, in its own way, the correct set of priorities. They still work together sometimes, professionally. MedVital still services the zoo's equipment, and Theo still calls her occasionally when his team is debating an edge case they want a working vet's read on, and she still answers, because the work matters more than the awkwardness. But the last text on her phone from him isn't signed off the way it used to be, and neither of them has tried to change that back. Naledi still checks every loaded dart twice, and now she checks the raw vital sign traces underneath every summary screen too, not because she distrusts every system on principle, but because she learned, in 90 very specific seconds, exactly what a calm amber banner can be quietly standing on top of, and some mornings, walking past Amara's enclosure before her shift starts, she still finds herself watching the tiger's slow, steady breathing for a few seconds longer than strictly necessary. Just to be sure.